Now, if you went through high school anytime from about 1970, perhaps up till the year 2000, you were probably expected to read, at some point, S.E. Hinton's classic young adult novel, The Outsiders. Anyone ever read that in high school? A few. It was written in 1965. I just found out that S.E. Hinton was 16 years old when she wrote that, and it got published when she was 18. That's amazing. It's a profoundly insightful book on the struggles of young adults in the face of society and culture at the time. So it's really remarkable that she did that. Another interesting tidbit, the first church I ever served as youth pastor at 30 years ago in Wayville, New York, had a fantastic professional artist in the congregation named Gary Watson. And Gary was S.E. Hinton's prime illustrator. So he illustrated covers for many of S.E. Hinton's books. And the neat thing he did, he would take teens from the youth group and use them as the models for his covers on the book. So here there's actual teens that I know that are on the covers of some of these S.E. Hinton books that he did. If you don't know the story of The Outsiders, it's a story of really gang rivalry. I believe the story takes place in 1965. There's two gangs. There's the upper-class, preppy socials, and they call themselves the Socs, S-O-C, apostrophe S. And then there's the lower-class, working-class greasers. And the whole story is about the conflict between the two. And it's very much a coming-of-age type of novel. Particularly, it focuses on the lead characters in the Greasers gang. Pony Boy and Soda Pop are the two main characters in that. They all have kind of weird names, Derry and Soda Pop and all these guys. So it also kind of focuses on the transformation they go through as they're kind of growing up and experiencing the conflicts and stresses of life. A huge theme of the work, which would be said by that title, The Outsiders, is that of isolation. These greasers just don't seem to fit in. They're obviously in conflict with the other gang, but they just don't seem to fit in with society. They're separated by class, they're separated by money, they're separated by opportunity, and they're just isolated. And that's where this term, she chose the title of The Outsiders. Well, I want to talk to you this morning about a simple little word in Greek that appears a number of times in the New Testament. And that word is exothen. And it is translated as outside in Scripture. The vast majority of the time, the overwhelming majority of the time, it is used to mean outside as opposed to inside, physically. You're outside, I'm inside. And the remarkable thing is, it is most commonly used. Jesus uses this word to beat up on the Pharisees pretty regularly. You know the passages where he says to the Pharisees, you guys clean the outside of the cup, exothen, but you don't clean the inside of the cup. So he's saying, you guys look good on the outside, but you're rotten on the inside. And then he says, you guys are like whitewashed tombs. You're painted all nice on the outside, exothen, but on the inside, you're full of dead man's bones. And then he goes on to say, it's not what is outside a person that defiles them, exothen. It's what comes out of their inside that defiles them. So it literally means outside versus inside. And he uses this very simple word to call the Pharisees to task repeatedly. However, there are three scriptures in the New Testament where this word, exothen, isn't translated outside. It's translated outsiders, because it is specifically directed towards people that are not part of the church, those that are outside the faith, those that are outside of the church, those that are not yet believers. And it kind of makes a good three-point sermon. I'm going to look briefly at all three of those scriptures and see the things that it says about reaching and relating to outsiders. So the first of those scriptures is from 1 Timothy 3:7. This one is particularly in the list of qualifications for leaders in the church, for elders and deacons, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that this could easily apply to anyone who strives to live a faithful Christian life as well. So 1 Timothy 3:7 says, he, meaning this elder or deacon that's being qualified, deacon, he must have a good reputation with outsiders, exothen, so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. We must have a good reputation with outsiders. You may have heard the verse from Proverbs 22 where it says, a good reputation is better than riches. Better than silver or gold is a good name. And it's very simply making that point that we are to have a good reputation with outsiders. And it goes on to say, so that you will not fall into disgrace. Obviously, none of us want to suffer disgrace in the face of anybody, let alone that of outsiders. He's making the point here that when we are interacting with outsiders, we need to be all the more sure that we are living a life that is above board and a good reputation as we are representing Christ faithfully to them. But then even goes into one little farther step, and I found this a little interesting. I wasn't really sure what to make of this. Have a good reputation with outsiders, so he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. And I got thinking, wow, there can be some kind of Satan's trap in our interaction with outsiders, with those that don't know the faith. And I suppose the simple trap would be we fall into their way of life rather than calling them to Christ's ways of life. You know, you've heard that verse that says, bad company corrupts good morals. We have to be careful as Christians that we are being the light and salt of Christ when we are out among outsiders and not losing our reputation, not falling into disgrace and falling into Satan's trap. Now, I was a tad hesitant to even mention this because of all the things our church is great at, we're not the best yet at reaching outsiders. And I don't want anyone thinking, oh, there's a trap waiting for me out there. I'm going to do it even less than I've been doing now. I'm going to stop thinking about reaching outsiders. No, that's not the point of that. We still have to reach outsiders, but we just have to be wise in how we do it and realize that there are obviously temptations and snares and whatnot out there in that nasty old fallen world. But he who is in us is greater than he who is in the world. And we can go out there with full confidence and full love and full power and represent Christ to those that are outside. All right, the second verse that uses this term exothen, not as outside, but as people, outsiders, is from 1 Thessalonians 11 and 12. This is what it says. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, exothen, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Now, in this verse passage particularly, Paul is addressing a couple of very specific things that are going on in the Thessalonian church. When you read both 1 Thessalonians, I think it's my least favorite book in the Bible to actually have to say, Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians, he's addressing a couple of different times two specific things that are going on in the church. There are people that were refusing to work. Some just because of laziness and idleness, but some were saying, oh, Christ is coming back now. We can just cash everything in and wait. Why work when Christ will be back by the end of the week? And Jesus is saying, or Paul says to them, no, you can't be idle. You need to keep working. And then he also addresses a couple of times in those epistles this idea of busybodies. People that are not only not doing anything, but then are getting all worried and anxious and putting their nose in other people's business. So he's specifically addressing lazy non-workers and busybodies in this passage. And he just brings out several simple qualities to address those things. If you're a busybody, he says, lead a quiet life. Mind your own business. It doesn't get any more clear than that. Now, again, he's speaking to busybodies. He's not speaking to appropriate, loving, concerned care, bearing one another's burdens as brothers and sisters in Christ. That's not a busybody kind of thing. That's not a mind your own business kind of thing. That is something that we are deeply and truly called to be intimately involved in each other's lives, to bear each other's burdens, and to lift one another up. But most of us know the difference between that and being a nosy busybody. Someone that just doesn't have enough to do, and they're going to stick their nose in other people's business, primarily out of like anxiousness or worry or being nosy, and that's the kind of things that are being drawn out by this word, busybody and minding your own business. Then he goes on to say, work with your hands, just as we told you. He's telling those people who were refusing to work, no, work with your hands. Get to work, whatever God has called you to do, because that is what we're called to do. And then he says, perhaps most importantly, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders and you won't be dependent on anybody. Those that weren't working eventually got to the point, Christ didn't come back and they were still working, so if they didn't go back to work, they would have to be dependent on somebody. And maybe even dependent on those that weren't saved for their welfare. And Christ is saying, no, as Christians, we shouldn't be dependent on anybody. We should be working faithfully as unto Christ, as unto our calling, and being able to provide for ourselves, working with our hands. And then he says, let your daily life win the respect of outsiders. Very simple, but very powerful when you think about it. And I think we all aspire to do this. And I was just having a conversation before the service with the folks that were involved in the service. That it's not, we're talking about outsiders here. So it's not so much what happens here in this service on a Sunday morning. It's about what happens out there from Sunday at noon until next Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Let your lives so reflect Christ that it wins the respect of outsiders. Let your daily life be of such quality that it attracts the attention and wins the respect of outsiders. I know many of you, perhaps most of you, fairly well, and I would say many of our lives are fairly exemplary in this manner. That a lot of people in the world that perhaps struggle with deeper, more awful things than we're struggling with could look at us and say, wow, that guy or that lady has their life together. I would aspire to be like that. I think we all would agree we can always find more of Christ, be more like Him, strive to be more like Him, and reflect Him and His aroma more thoroughly and carefully with those that we are coming in contact with. Let's examine our daily lives, the quality of daily lives. I say not in a navel-gazing, woe is me, I stink, I'm an awful Christian manner, but with honest humility before God. God, here are the great things You've worked in my life, and I'm thankful for that. Here are the things I'm still struggling with. Please help me. Let my daily life reflect You in a way that outsiders sit up and take notice. All right, third and finally, and this is probably my favorite of the three, and maybe most even directly related and appropriate to the things we're talking about in reaching outsiders. And this is from Colossians 4, verses 2 through 6. Paul starts by saying, devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. There's a couple more verses I'm going to get to in a minute. But first, he's setting the stage in clearly evangelistic context and evangelistic setting. He's saying, hey, pray for me that I can proclaim the message as I should, that I can proclaim this message of Christ, that I have the boldness to do so, and that God would open doors that I can speak it freely. So he's asking for prayer from the Colossians, really for help and assistance in being a faithful witness of Christ to proclaim the message as he should. Then he goes on to encourage and exhort the Colossians to do similar things. And this is what he says next to them. Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Exothen. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. He says several very simple, but yet rather insightful things of how we can conduct ourselves when we're interacting with outsiders. He starts by saying, be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Very simply, none of us want to be known as fools. None of us want to act foolishly. We want to be wise in how we conduct ourselves with outsiders. And that, we face decisions every day on how to do. You have a friend that's down and out, and they want to borrow money from you, and you are wondering, man, do I actually give them money, or do I give them a gift card so I know they might spend it on alcohol if I give them money, or should I not give them anything because I've just been enabling them too long? there are these kind of very practical wisdom decisions that we probably make with people in our lives, be it family, neighbors, friends, community members, strangers. How do I act in a wise way that will show them Christ, lift them up, show them compassion without enabling them, but rather empower them to be more the flourishing human that God has called them to be? A lot of simple calls to be wise in our conduct towards outsiders on a daily basis. Then he goes on to say, make the most of every opportunity. I think of all the things in these 3 verses, that's the phrase that jumped out at me the most. Make the most of every opportunity. I bet you if we were to really stop and think about it and really be honest with ourselves, I bet you we have opportunities probably on a daily basis, maybe even more than once a day, to take the most of every opportunity to represent Christ in some way, shape, or form to an outsider. And we probably either ignore those opportunities or maybe just are caught up with other things in the day and aren't walking in discernment enough to recognize that opportunity when it comes up. I have that happen a lot. I bet you at least once a month something happens, and 4 seconds after I've left it, I say to myself, I wish I had said that, or I wish I had done so-and-so. I didn't take advantage of that opportunity. And I've been asking God, make me more aware and in tune to your Spirit in helping people. Over the Christmas season, in 2 consecutive days, I had these 2 things happening. I think we told the story here where I walked in and some lady was kind of yelling, kind of crying to one of the store personnel. I didn't talk to her, but when she left, I asked the store person, is everything okay? And he said, well, some crazy, spiteful relative just destroyed her entire Christmas setup, including all the presents for her kids, and now they don't have anything. And that was when I went, I talked to the elders, and they were very gracious and donated some money, and I went back and I took it to that store person, and they gave it to that woman. I know that happened. I've not heard back from the lady or anyone. We're not looking for a pat on the back. But I do know that happened, that woman got the money that our church donated to really save her Christmas. So great. It was an opportunity. I took advantage of that opportunity, and then our church took advantage of that opportunity to minister Christ. It was either the very next day, or it may have been the day after that. I can't remember which. I'm at Walmart again. And as I'm leaving, there is I'm going to assume, homeless person, certainly down and out, dirty, honestly, the most smelly person I've ever been next to in my life. And he needed a ride downtown. And he happened to approach me. Can I have a ride downtown? I'm like, sure. And I let him in my car, and he stunk to high heaven. I'm not saying that to be mean. It's just the fact. He stunk. Like, stay in the car after you leave kind of stink. And I only had to drive him a couple miles down the street. He had me drop him off at in front of the laundromat down under, right when you go into the underpass on the right, there's a laundromat down there. I don't know if that was actually where it was going. You didn't want me to know and see where it was actually being dropped off, but he had me drop me off at the laundromat. And I had to spray my car down with every and anything I could find in my house after he got out of my vehicle. But when I had him in the car, I just had a couple of seconds to say, hey, how you doing? Do you need anything? Can I do anything for you? I expected him to say, can I have some money? Can you give me something to eat? But he did not. He just said, no, thank you for this ride. That's all I needed for today. And I was just, I don't know, I can't remember if I interjected Christ into that conversation or not. I said something like, well, I'm real glad I was able to help. Have a blessed day. I bet you it wasn't too hard to take advantage of those opportunities. I mean, both of those things were right in your face, and you've got a choice. Are you going to obey God or not? A lot of times it's a lot more subtle of recognizing opportunities. I can think of several times, particularly in checkout lines at supermarkets for some reason, where I'll notice someone in line who's obviously upset about something. And I felt a tug in my spirit to ask them, are you okay? Can I do anything for you? Do you need anything? And I've not said anything or done anything because that's an awkward thing to do. And I've not obeyed what I felt in that moment was probably the prompting of the Holy Spirit to address that person. I did not make the most of that opportunity. My entire life, or entire adult life of having a family, I've kind of gotten a reputation for being a bit of a compulsive whistler, believe it or not. I will tend to get a song in my head and just be whistling it without even realizing it. Growing up, when my wife was staying home with the kids and I was working, I was usually the first one up in the house, and I would hear almost every day, "Dad, you woke us up. You're stomping through the house whistling. Will you quit that?" The dogs always know when I come home because they hear me whistling in the driveway before they see me, and they're all like happy and whatnot. Well, just recently, I found a new radio station that I like in my car, and I have it on all the time when I'm driving. So almost any time I get out of my car anywhere, I find myself whistling or humming a lot. There's worse habits than you can do. There's probably even more annoying habits you can do than be happy and whistling all the time. Well, just this last week, I'm in the Y, and I'm in front of my locker whistling. And since this happened, I've caught myself almost every day on the Y whistling in front of my locker or humming. But anyway, this is just this last week. I'm whistling, and the guy a few lockers down comments on it. And he acted a little annoyed. He said something to the fact that my whistling sounded like wind screeching through a cracked window, is what he said. He literally said something like that. I don't think he was trying to be flattering. He kind of said it in a lighthearted way, but he was talking about cracked glass and windows, air rushing. I'm like, okay, ha, ha, ha. We kind of leave the locker room at the same time. We go and do our exercise. We end up back at the locker at the same time afterwards, a half hour later. I'm still whistling a half hour later. I'm doing the same thing with the same guy. And this time he said something, but a lot more positively inclined towards it. He said something about, you seem kind of happy still, or you're still whistling, you seem kind of happy. And just in that second, I thought, and I said, well, I'm a Christian, and it's probably the joy of the Lord, to tell you the truth. And that's all I said. And you'll find, more often than not, when you do something like that, in that kind of stranger context, they will change the subject very quickly. And he did. He went on to other stuff, but I had 3 seconds to say, well, thanks for noticing. I'm a Christian. I'd like to think it's the joy of the Lord. And I got to speak that to him. I would like to think I took the most of that opportunity. I don't want to get hung up on, well, what's the most? I could have given him the 4 spiritual laws, too. I could have offered to pay off his student loan debt or whatever, all the blah, 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 blah. I don't want us to get all legalistic and performance-related about it. In your spirit, you're going to know what most is for you, what God's calling you to do. And I felt like in that second, I took the most of that opportunity. I also regularly, in the Y, there's a whole staff of janitorial staff there. And they're always there working when the people are working. When almost any time I see one of them working, if I catch their eye, I'll say, thank you so much for keeping this place clean. I know you don't get enough credit, but I really appreciate what you do. And I've had the opportunity to say that, I think, to every person on that staff at least once. And it just tremendously blesses their day. I try to do the same thing with fast food workers when I'm in fast food restaurants. When they're busy, they're not getting paid much, they're probably not thrilled to work there, and most people kind of in their hearts disparage what they do. And if I just notice someone doing a good job, I'll say, hey, thanks. You really filled my order great. It was quick. You're very pleasant. You're really good at what you do here. Thank you for that. I do that pretty regularly. I'm not trying to build myself up at all. I am not the most discerning, caring, compassionate person you're ever going to meet. And most of you probably know that if you know me. I have my moments. I can be all right. But I'm trying to get better. And I'm asking God to help me. How can I make the most of every opportunity? Just to bless someone else's life, show their love, go above and beyond in a way that shows the love of Christ beyond what just the world calls love or what the world offers. And we can make the most of every opportunity. We have to train our eye and ask God to give us the discernment to notice those opportunities with outsiders and take the most of them. If it's speaking a word or giving money or doing whatever, taking the opportunity to build them up in the name of Christ. That's what we're called to do with those outsiders. And then finally and lastly, he tells us a little bit of how to do that. Let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. We all know what it means to treat someone else with grace. Most of us are probably pretty good at that most of the time. Being seasoned with salt, being flavorful and appealing in our gracious approach to people when we talk to them. But the last thing he says is, so that you may know how to answer everyone. It would be really easy to get hung up on that. Most Christians that I know, the overwhelming majority, are very self-conscious about, I'm going to get asked a question that I can't answer. And so I'm not going to open my mouth or even say anything. And here Paul is saying that we should know how to answer everyone. That doesn't mean always having the right answer. Sometimes the right answer is, you know what, friend? Great question. I don't know the answer. But I tell you what, I'm going to go home, I'm going to look this up, I'm going to find you an answer, and maybe tomorrow when I see you in the YMZ locker room, I'll have an answer for you. Tell you what, why don't you go home and look up too, and then we'll compare answers that we found. Knowing how to answer doesn't mean I have to be the Christian answer boy and have the right answer all the time. Sometimes I will, but sometimes the right answer is, I don't know, but I love you enough to work it out with you and find out the answer. Let's not get hung up on, I can't say anything because they're going to ask me about why babies die and why people get raped and why there's war in Africa and I don't have a good answer because those are the things that always come up. And they're going to ask me how I can prove that God even exists, and I don't know, I can't prove that, so I'm not going to say anything. Let's not let those insecurities, those fears, keep us from making the most of every opportunity and being the aroma of Christ. A lot of times we will know how to answer and have the right answer, and sometimes we won't, and the right answer is, man, I just don't know, but I want you to know I love you, and let's find out this answer together. All right, back to and closing with the outsiders. In that story, I mentioned Pony Boy is the main character, and he's actually the narrator of the story. I think he's 14 years old in this story. And it's really interesting to watch his development through the story. He just grows in appreciation for people that are outsiders and other people that are outsiders, and appreciating their struggles and where they are at, and simply loving, helping, being there for them. He just kind of grows in that way. That's a pretty good example for us, being aware of the outsiders, being consciously aware of the outsiders. But I think my favorite character in the whole book, she's not really a minor character, not really a major character, somewhere in between, is a girl named Cherry. Cherry is a member of the Soch gang, the upper-class preppy gang, and her boyfriend is in the preppy gang too. And in the story, her boyfriend Bob gets killed in a gang incident. And that creates all sorts of stress and drama. But all throughout this process, she becomes friends with Pony Boy and a couple other members in the Greaser group too. And her loyalties are really torn by birth and by class and by money and by opportunity. She is a social. She's a preppy. But by kind of heart and by circumstance, she comes to be very loyal and very fond of, in particular, Pony Boy. And she shows much sensitivity, much courage, much wisdom, and much honesty in her willingness to try to bridge that gap between the in crowd and the outsider crowd. I don't want to push that too far, but you know where I'm going. Not a bad Christ figure. Not a bad example of what Christians ought to be like. You know, it's easy to have a country club mentality in the church, that we're the in and they're the out, and never the twain shall meet. And we need to be those people that find ways to bridge that gap, showing the courage, the honesty, the sensitivity, the loyalty, whatever, to cross that bridge. And there are gaps between here, in, and exothin, outsiders. There's worldview gaps and religious gaps and philosophical gaps and morality gaps and ethical gaps and cultural gaps, and there might be language barriers and stereotype, resentment barriers that folks have outside. All sorts of barriers that we confront on a daily basis when we interact with outsiders. And here we are being encouraged to make the most of every opportunity. Let's be Christ's ambassadors. The great passage that Brad read for us this morning. Go and make disciples of all peoples, telling them to obey everything that Christ spoke. And that's really what we're doing. going, getting outside these doors, face-to-face contact with outsiders, loving them well, showing them Christ, and taking the most of every opportunity.